The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and despair. But Javier Torres clung to the faint hum of the city outside, a lifeline beyond the sterile walls. At 17, he lay broken physically from the accident, emotionally from the fists of his father, who'd scream Maricon with every blow the night he caught Javier kissing a boy. Now, with both legs gone below the knees, Javier wondered if freedom was just a word people threw around to feel better about their cages. San Francisco in 2018 was a kaleidoscope of dreams and defiance, a city where rainbow flags flew like promises. Javier had fled his father's house in Fresno 6 months ago, chasing whispers of acceptance in the Castro district. He'd found a job at a tiny bike shop, fixing gears and chains with hands that moved like they knew the world's secrets. But the accident, a drunk driver, a shattered bike, and a scream that wasn't his had stolen his legs and nearly his will to keep going. The hospital bed was his prison now, and the future felt like a door slammed shut. Theo Carter was the first person to make that door crack open. A volunteer at the hospital. Theo was 20, all lanky limbs and quiet confidence, with a smile that could thaw the coldest heart. He wasn't like the others who came and went with pity in their eyes. Theo brought a sketchbook, filled with drawings of fantastical machinist prosthetics that looked like they belonged in a sci-fi film. Not a hospital. You're gonna walk again, Javier, Theo said that first day, his voice steady as he sketched. And not just walk. You're gonna fly. Javier didn't believe him. Not at first. He'd learned early that trust was a luxury, one his father's fists had beaten out of him. Growing up in Fresno, Javier had hidden who he was, burying his feelings for boys under layers of fear. His mother had been his shield, whispering love in Spanish when his father's rage filled the house. But she died when he was 12, and the house became a battlefield. When his father caught him kissing Mateo, a shy classmate, behind the school, the beating left Javier with a broken rib and a promise to himself. He'd escape or die trying. San Francisco had been his salvation, or so he thought. The Castro was alive with people who didn't flinch at two men holding hands, where Javier could breathe without looking over his shoulder. He'd met others like him, artists, dreamers, survivors who wore their identities like badges of honor. But the accident had stripped that away, leaving him to wonder if he'd ever belong anywhere again. Theo, though, was relentless. Every day, he'd sit by Javier's bed, sketching, talking, or just listening. He'd grown up in Oakland, raised by a single mom who taught him to see beauty in broken things. My mom used to say people are like mosaics, Theo told him once, his pencil scratching softly against paper. The cracks are what make you unique. Javier wanted to scoff, but something in Theo's eyes, warm, unyielding, made him listen. One afternoon, Theo brought a prototype. It was a single prosthetic blade, sleek and lightweight, with a curve that looked more like art than medicine. This is just the start, Theo said, holding it up. I'm studying biomedical engineering at Berkeley. I've been designing these since I was a kid, dreaming of building things that give people their lives back. Javier stared at the blade, his throat tight. He didn't know if he wanted to hope. Hope had betrayed him before. But Theo wasn't asking for permission. He was already measuring Javier's stumps, talking about weight distribution and socket fittings like they were planning a rocket launch. You're not just getting legs, Theo said, his eyes bright with purpose. You're getting you back. For the first time since the accident, Javier felt a spark, a tiny, fragile thing, but enough to keep him from sinking. Weeks turned into months, and Theo's visits became Javier's anchor. They talked about everything. Music. Javier loved salsa. Theo was obsessed with jazz. Dreams. Javier wanted to open his own bike shop. Theo wanted to revolutionize prosthetics and the weight of their pasts. Theo shared how he'd come out at 16, how his mom had hugged him and said, "You're my son, and that's all that matters." Javier envied that love, but he never said it. Instead, he let Theo's warmth fill the cracks in his heart. Physical therapy was brutal. Javier's stumps ached, and the temporary prosthetics felt like shackles. But Theo was there, cheering him on, sketching designs for custom blades that would let Javier run again. One day, as Javier struggled to take a step, Theo knelt beside him, adjusting the socket. Their hands brushed, and Javier's breath caught. Theo looked up, their eyes locking, and for a moment, the world was just them two boys. One broken, one unbreakable, bound by something neither could name. By the time Javier was discharged, he was walking on Theo's prototype blades. They were rough, experimental, but they felt like an extension of him. He moved with a grace he hadn't known was possible, each step a defiance of the accident, of his father, of every voice that had ever told him he was less. Theo watched him with pride, but there was something else in his gaze, something that made Javier's heart race in a way he hadn't felt since Mateo. They started spending time outside the hospital. Theo took Javier to his favorite spot, a quiet park in Oakland where they could see the bay glisten under the stars. They'd sit on a blanket, Theo sketching, Javier talking about the life he wanted to build. One night, Theo reached for Javier's hand, his fingers warm and steady. "I'm proud of you," Theo said softly. Javier wanted to say something back, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he squeezed Theo's hand, and they sat in silence, the city humming around them. But Javier's past wasn't done with him. A letter arrived at the halfway house where he was staying, the handwriting unmistakable. His father. The words were a knife. "You're no son of mine. Come back and face me, or I'll find you." Fear gripped Javier, pulling him back to that Fresno bedroom, to the sound of fists against flesh. He didn't tell Theo. He couldn't. Theo was light, and this was darkness Javier didn't want to share. Javier burned the letter in the halfway house's tiny courtyard, watching the flames curl around his father's words. He told himself it was over, that San Francisco was his home now, that the man who'd broken him couldn't touch him anymore. But at night, the nightmares came, his father's voice, the crunch of bone, the screech of tires before the world went black. Theo noticed the change. Javier's smiles grew rare, his eyes distant. They were at the bike shop one afternoon, Javier tweaking a chain while Theo sketched nearby. When Theo finally asked, "What's going on?" "Javi, you're here, but you're not." Javier's hands froze on the wrench. He wanted to tell Theo everything, the letter, the fear, the shame that clung to him like damp rot. But he couldn't. Just tired. He lied, forcing a grin. Theo didn't push, but his eyes said he wasn't fooled. The bike shop was Javier's sanctuary. The owner, a gruff lesbian named Marla, had taken him in after the accident, giving him a job and a purpose. The shop was a haven for misfits, queer kids, runaways, dreamers who fixed bikes and swapped stories. Javier loved the rhythm of it, the clink of tools, the smell of grease, the satisfaction of making something broken whole again. But the letter had cracked that peace, reminding him that safety was fragile. Theo, meanwhile, was pouring himself into the prosthetics. He'd secured a grant from Berkeley to develop his designs, and Javier was his test subject. The new blades were lighter, stronger, with carbon fiber cores and custom sockets that fit Javier like a second skin. Theo's excitement was infectious, and Javier found himself running for the first time since the accident, his blades slicing through the air. It felt like flying, just as Theo had promised. But even that joy couldn't silence the fear gnawing at him. One evening, Theo invited Javier to a queer art showcase in the Mission District. The gallery was alive with color paintings of lovers embracing, sculptures of bodies defying gravity, poetry scrawled on the walls. Javier felt out of place, his scars and blades making him hyper-visible. But Theo's hand on his arm grounded him. "You belong here," Theo whispered, and Javier wanted to believe him. They stopped at a painting of two men dancing under a starry sky, their bodies intertwined in a way that felt achingly familiar. Javier's heart thudded as he glanced at Theo, whose eyes were fixed on the canvas. "What do you see?" Theo asked softly. Javier hesitated, then said, "Freedom." Theo smiled, and for a moment, Javier forgot his father's letter, forgot the nightmares. But when they left the gallery, a man was waiting outside the man with Javier's eyes and a scowl that stopped Javier's heart. It was his father, Miguel. He'd tracked Javier down, just as he'd promised. "You think you can run from me?" Miguel spat, his voice low and venomous. The street was busy, but Javier felt alone, exposed, his blades suddenly heavy. Theo stepped forward, placing himself between them. "Who are you?" Theo demanded, his voice steady but sharp. Miguel ignored him, his eyes locked on Javier. "You're coming home. You're going to fix this." Javier's throat closed. He wanted to run, but his blades felt like anchors. Theo's hand found his, squeezing tight. "He's not going anywhere," Theo said, his voice a shield. Miguel's face twisted, and for a moment, Javier thought he'd swing. But the crowd around them, artists, friends, strangers closed in, their presence a quiet warning. Miguel backed off, muttering curses, but his eyes promised he'd be back. That night, Javier told Theo everything. They sat on the roof of Theo's apartment, the city sprawling below them. Javier spoke of the beatings, the shame, the way his father's love had turned to hate when he learned who Javier was. Theo listened, his face unreadable but his hand never leaving Javier's. When Javier finished, Theo said, "You're not his. You're yours. And you're enough." Javier's eyes burned, but he didn't cry. Instead, he leaned into Theo, their shoulders touching, and felt something new, not just hope, but strength. Theo doubled down on the prosthetics, determined to give Javier more than just the ability to walk. He worked late into the night, sketching and building, his dorm room a chaos of tools and blueprints. Javier started helping, learning the math and mechanics behind the designs. They became a team, their hands moving in sync as they crafted blades that weren't just functional but beautiful, etched with patterns inspired by the San Francisco skyline, by the curves of the bay. But Miguel's shadow loomed. Javier spotted him twice more, once outside the bike shop, once near the halfway house. Each time, fear clawed at him, but Theo's presence kept him grounded. "He can't take you," Theo said fiercely one night, as they worked on a new blade design. "Not unless you let him." Javier wanted to believe it, but the nightmares were getting worse, and he could feel his father's rage closing in. The nightmares bled into Javier's days, blurring the line between memory and reality. He'd wake gasping, his father's voice echoing in his skull, and even the weight of Theo's hand on his couldn't fully pull him back. But the work, the prosthetics, the bike shop, the slow rebuilding of himself kept him moving forward, one unsteady step at a time. Theo's latest design was a breakthrough. The blades were lighter than ever, with a spring mechanism that gave Javier a bounce in his step, almost like he was dancing. They tested them on a track at Berkeley, Theo timing Javier's sprints with a stopwatch and a grin that lit up the morning. "You're a rocket, Javi," Theo shouted as Javier tore down the track, the wind in his face, his blades singing against the ground. For those fleeting seconds, Javier felt untouchable, like he could outrun his past. But the past was stubborn. Javier started getting texts from an unknown number short. Vicious messages you can't hide forever. He didn't need to guess who they were from. He deleted them, but each one left a bruise on his heart. Theo noticed Javier's phone buzzing one night as they ate takeout in Theo's dorm. "Who's that?" Theo asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. Javier shrugged, muttering, "Spam." Theo didn't push, but Javier could feel his worry. The bike shop became their refuge. Marla, the owner, had started letting Javier experiment with custom bike frames, blending his love for bikes with Theo's engineering genius. They designed a bike that worked with Javier's blades, its frame low and sleek, built for speed. Working together, their hands brushing over metal and tools, felt like a language of its own. Javier caught himself watching Theo's focus, his quiet intensity, and felt a pull he couldn't name. One night, after closing the shop, Theo kissed him. It was sudden, soft, under the flickering fluorescent lights, with the smell of grease and metal around them. Javier froze, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from something brighter, something alive. "I'm sorry," Theo said quickly, stepping back. "I shouldn't have," but Javier grabbed his hand, pulling him close, and kissed him back. It was clumsy, urgent, but it felt like coming home. They didn't talk about it after. Not right away. But something shifted. Theo's touches lingered, his smile softer, and Javier found himself opening up in ways he hadn't thought possible. They spent more time together, not just working but living, cooking meals in Theo's tiny kitchen, watching old movies, laughing until their sides hurt. Javier started to believe he could build a life here, with Theo, in a city that didn't care who he loved. But Miguel wasn't done. One evening, as Javier and Theo walked through the Castro, hands brushing but not quite holding, Javier saw him again. His father stood across the street, watching, his face a mask of contempt. Javier's breath hitched, and Theo followed his gaze. "That's him, isn't it?" Theo said, his voice low. Javier nodded, unable to speak. Theo took his hand, firm and unyielding. "He doesn't get to win." They kept walking, but Javier's heart was a drum. That night, he told Theo about the texts. Theo's face hardened, and he grabbed his laptop, pulling up resources for restraining orders, support groups, anything to keep Miguel at bay. "You're not alone in this," Theo said, his voice fierce. "You've got me. Marla. The whole damn shop. He can't touch you." Javier wanted to believe him, but fear was a language he spoke fluently. The next day, they went to the police station. Filing the restraining order felt like a small victory, but Javier knew his father wasn't the type to respect paper. Still, Theo's presence steady, unwavering, made it bearable. They celebrated with coffee at a Castro cafe, rainbow flags fluttering outside. Theo sketched on a napkin a new prosthetic design with wings etched into the sides. "For when you're ready to soar," he said, sliding it to Javier. Javier's chest ached with something too big for words, but the fear lingered. Javier started checking over his shoulder, jumping at shadows. Theo noticed, and one night, as they lay on Theo's couch, Javier's head on his chest, Theo said, "You can't keep running from him in your head. We'll face him together." Javier didn't answer, but he held Theo tighter, letting his heartbeat drown out the echoes of his father's voice. At the bike shop, their custom bike was taking shape. Javier poured himself into it, welding and sanding, while Theo fine-tuned the prosthetics. They were a team, not just in work, but in life, their bond growing stronger with every shared moment. But Javier knew it couldn't last, not with Miguel out there, waiting for his chance. The bike was finished on a crisp October morning, its frame gleaming under the shop's lights. Javier ran his hand along its curves, feeling the weight of every weld, every choice that had brought it to life. Theo stood beside him, his eyes bright with pride. "This is us," Theo said, his voice warm. "You and me, making something unstoppable." They took it to the park for a test ride. Javier's blades clicked into the custom pedals, and as he pushed off, the world blurred. The bike moved like an extension of him, fast and fluid, the wind carrying away the weight of his fear. Theo ran alongside, laughing, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. For the first time in months, Javier felt free, not just from his father, but from the doubts that had chained him. But freedom was fragile. That night, Javier's phone buzzed again. "You think a piece of paper stops me?" The restraining order hadn't worked. Miguel was closer, angrier. Javier showed Theo the text, his hands shaking. Theo's jaw tightened, but his voice was calm. We need to be smart. We'll get security at the shop. Talk to Marla. He's not getting near you. Marla didn't hesitate. She installed cameras, hired a guard, and told Javier, this shop's your home. Nobody messes with family. The words hit Javier hard, stirring memories of his mother's love, now echoed in this makeshift family of misfits. But even Marla's fierceness couldn't stop the dread pooling in Javier's gut. Theo had an idea. He'd been invited to present his prosthetic designs at a tech conference in San Jose, and he wanted Javier to come not just as a guest, but as a partner. Show them what these blades can do, Theo said, his eyes alight. Show them who you are? Javier hesitated. The idea of standing in front of strangers, his scars and blades on display, terrified him. But Theo's belief in him was a tether, pulling him forward. The conference was a whirlwind of innovation robots, drones, and Theo's prosthetics stealing the show. Javier wore the latest blades, their wing etchings catching the light as he walked the stage with Theo. He spoke about the accident, his recovery, and how Theo's designs had given him more than legs. They'd given him a future. The crowd applauded, but Javier's eyes were on Theo, whose smile said everything words couldn't. After the presentation, a woman approached them, a biotech investor named Clara. She'd been moved by Javier's story and Theo's designs, offering to fund their work. You two are a team, she said, handing Theo her card. Build something that changes lives. Javier felt a surge of possibility, but it was cut short by a familiar figure in the crowd, Miguel, watching from the back, his presence a storm cloud. Javier froze, but Theo's hand on his shoulder steadied him. He's not here for you, Theo whispered. He's here to scare you. Don't let him. They left the conference quickly, Clara's card in Theo's pocket. But Javier's heart was racing. Miguel wasn't giving up, and Javier knew a confrontation was coming. Back in San Francisco, they threw themselves into work. The investor's offer meant they could start a small company, blending Theo's prosthetics with Javier's bike designs. They dreamed of a workshop where they could create, not just for themselves, but for others who'd lost pieces of themselves. But Miguel's texts kept coming, each one a reminder that Javier's past wasn't finished with him. One night, as they worked late in the shop, the power went out. The darkness was sudden, heavy, and Javier's stomach dropped. He grabbed Theo's hand, his breath shallow. It's him, Javier whispered. Theo didn't argue. He pulled Javier toward the back door. But before they could reach it, the front window shattered. Miguel stood there, a crowbar in his hand, his face twisted with rage. You think you can just walk away? Miguel roared, stepping through the broken glass. Javier's legs, his blades felt useless, his fear rooting him to the spot. Theo stepped in front of him, his voice steady. Get out, or I call the cops. Miguel laughed, a sound that chilled Javier's blood. He's mine, Miguel said, pointing the crowbar at Javier. You don't get to keep him. The guard Marla had hired burst in, tackling Miguel before he could move closer. The police arrived minutes later, cuffing Miguel as he spat curses. Javier watched, trembling, as his father was dragged away. Theo held him, whispering, It's over. You're safe. But Javier knew it wasn't over, not yet. Not until he faced the fear inside him. Miguel's arrest should have been the end, but it felt like a pause. Javier couldn't shake the image of his father's face, twisted with hate, or the weight of knowing he'd come so close to losing everything again. Theo stayed by his side, sleeping on the couch in Javier's tiny room at the halfway house. His presence a quiet promise that Javier wasn't alone. The shop was repaired, the window replaced, but Javier felt exposed. Marla gave him time off, but he didn't want it. Work was his lifeline, the place where he could lose himself in metal and motion. He and Theo started planning their company, using Clara's funding to rent a small workshop near the bike shop. They called it Wings, a nod to the etchings on Javier's blades and the freedom they both chased. Javier threw himself into the work, designing bikes and prosthetics with Theo, their hands moving in sync. But the nightmares didn't stop. He'd wake up gasping, seeing his father's fists, hearing the screech of tires. Theo would hold him, whispering, "You're here. You're safe." But Javier wasn't sure he'd ever feel safe again. Theo suggested therapy. Javier resisted at first, the idea of baring his soul to a stranger unthinkable. But Theo's gentle persistence wore him down, and he started seeing a counselor named Dr. Lou, a queer woman with a sharp mind and a kind voice. She helped Javier name his fear, his shame, and slowly, he began to see himself not as broken, but as a survivor. Their relationship deepened. Theo moved into the halfway house with Javier, their nights filled with quiet moments cooking, laughing, sketching designs. Javier started to believe in a future where he could love without fear. But the legal battle with Miguel loomed. The restraining order was temporary, and Miguel's lawyer argued he was no threat. Javier had to testify, to face his father in court, and the thought made his stomach churn. The hearing was in a sterile courtroom, the air thick with tension. Javier sat beside Theo, his blades hidden under his pants, trying to look stronger than he felt. Miguel sat across the room, his eyes cold but calm, as if he'd already won. Javier's voice shook as he recounted the beatings, the accident, the texts, the night at the shop. Theo's hand on his knee kept him grounded, but every word felt like peeling back his skin. The judge extended the restraining order, but Miguel was released on bail. Javier left the courtroom feeling hollow, the victory small against the fear that his father would never stop. Theo pulled him close outside, whispering, "You did it. You faced him." Javier nodded, but his heart was heavy. He wanted to be free, but freedom felt like a destination he couldn't reach. Back at the workshop, they poured their energy into Wings. The first batch of prosthetics was ready sleek, affordable, designed for people like Javier who'd lost parts of themselves, but not their fight. They partnered with local clinics, offering fittings to amputees who'd never dreamed of running again. Javier saw himself in their eyes, the fear, the hope, and it gave him purpose. One evening, a kid named Riley came to the workshop. He was 15, a double amputee from a car accident, his eyes dull with resignation. Javier fitted him with a pair of blades, showing him how to balance, how to move. When Riley took his first steps, his face lit up, and Javier felt a warmth he hadn't known was possible. Theo watched, his smile soft, and later, as they closed up, he said, "You're changing lives, Javi. Not just yours." But the past wasn't done. A week later, Javier got a call from Dr. Lou. Miguel had violated the restraining order, showing up at her office, demanding to know where Javier was. The police were handling it, but Javier's fear roared back. He and Theo stayed up all night, planning. They installed alarms at the workshop, moved to a new apartment with better security, and Theo insisted on walking Javier everywhere. "I'm not losing you," Theo said, his voice fierce. Javier wanted to believe they could outrun Miguel, but he knew better. His father was a storm, and storms didn't stop until they'd torn everything apart. The new apartment was small, but theirs, filled with sketches and tools, a testament to the life Javier and Theo were building. Javier's blades clicked softly on the hardwood floor as he moved, a rhythm that felt like home. But the alarms they'd installed were a constant reminder of the threat outside. And Javier's sleep was fractured, his dreams a battlefield of his father's rage and the accident's chaos. Wings was growing. Clara's funding had brought in new equipment, and Javier and Theo hired a small team of other queer kids, engineers, dreamers who believed in their mission. They were designing prosthetics for kids like Riley, bikes for people who thought they'd never ride again. Javier found himself teaching, not just building, showing others how to reclaim their bodies. their lives. It was healing, but it didn't erase the fear. Miguel's violation of the restraining order led to a warrant, but he'd vanished. The police searched, but Javier knew his father was too stubborn to be caught easily. Every shadow felt like him, every noise a warning. Theo tried to keep things light, filling their nights with music and laughter. But Javier could see the worry in his eyes. One afternoon, as they fitted a client with a new prosthetic, Marla called. "Javi, you need to see this." She sent a link to a local news article. A man matching Miguel's description had been spotted in Oakland, harassing queer community centers. Javier's blood ran cold. Theo read the article over his shoulder, his jaw tight. "We're not hiding," Theo said. "We'll keep living, keep building. He doesn't get to stop us." Javier nodded, but his heart wasn't in it. He felt like a boy again, cowering in Fresno, waiting for the next blow. Dr. Lou helped him work through it, teaching him to ground himself in the present, the feel of his blades, the sound of Theo's voice. But the fear was a shadow he couldn't shake. They decided to host a community event at Wings, a showcase of their work and a fundraiser for queer youth. The workshop was packed: clients, supporters, kids like Riley who'd found hope in their designs. Javier spoke, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest, sharing his story of survival. Theo stood beside him, his hand brushing Javier's, a quiet anchor. The crowd cheered, but Javier's eyes scanned the room, searching for his father's face. He didn't see Miguel, but the fear followed him home. That night, as they lay in bed, Theo traced the scars on Javier's arm. "You're stronger than him," Theo whispered. "You've always been." Javier wanted to believe it, but the weight of his past was heavy. He kissed Theo, pouring everything: fear, love, hope into it. And for a moment, the world was just them. The next day, disaster struck. Javier and Theo were at the workshop when the fire alarms blared. Smoke poured from the back, where their prototypes were stored. Javier's heart stopped as he grabbed Theo, pulling him outside. The fire was small but deliberate arson, the firefighters said later. Javier knew who'd done it. Miguel's name wasn't spoken, but it hung in the air. The damage was minimal, but the message was clear. Miguel wasn't just a threat. He was a force, relentless and destructive. Javier wanted to give up, to run again, but Theo wouldn't let him. "We rebuild," Theo said, his voice fierce. "He doesn't get to destroy us." They salvaged what they could, working through the night to save their designs. The team rallied, Marla bringing coffee and tools, their community a shield against the darkness. But Javier was breaking. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, the fear consuming him. Theo noticed, pulling him aside one morning. "You can't keep carrying this alone," Theo said. "Let me help." Javier broke then, sobbing into Theo's chest, the weight of his father's hate spilling out. Theo held him, whispering promises of safety, of love, of a future they'd fight for. The police found Miguel a week later, hiding in a motel. He was arrested, charged with arson and violating the restraining order. Javier didn't feel relief, only exhaustion. The trial was coming, and he'd have to face his father again. But this time, he had Theo, Marla, Wings, the family he'd built from the ashes of his past. The trial was a storm Javier couldn't escape. The courtroom felt smaller this time, the air thick with the weight of everything unsaid. Miguel sat at the defense table, his face unreadable, but his eyes burned into Javier, stripping him bare. Theo's hand in his was the only thing keeping Javier from bolting. Javier testified again, his voice stronger now, fueled by the life he'd built. He spoke of the beatings, the accident, the fire, every way his father had tried to break him. He spoke of Theo, of Wings, of the kids like Riley who'd given him purpose. "I'm not your son anymore," Javier said, looking at Miguel. "I'm mine." The words felt like a blade, cutting the last tie between them. Miguel's lawyer tried to paint him as a grieving father, misguided but loving. But the evidence was damning texts. Witnesses. The arson report. The judge sentenced Miguel to 7 years. And as he was led away, Javier felt no victory, only a quiet release. His father was gone, not just from his life, but from his heart. The months that followed were a rebuilding. Wings grew, their prosthetics and bikes gaining attention beyond San Francisco. Javier and Theo moved into a bigger apartment, their walls covered with sketches and photos Riley's first run, Marla's grin at the shop, their community thriving. Javier's nightmares faded, replaced by dreams of racing on his blades, Theo cheering him on. One spring morning, they took their bikes to the Golden Gate Bridge. Javier's blades clicked into the pedals, the wind sharp against his face as they rode. Theo kept pace, his laughter bright, and when they stopped at the midpoint, the city sparkling below, Theo pulled Javier close. "You're flying," Theo said, his voice soft with awe. Javier smiled, his heart full. "We both are." They stood there, hands entwined, the bridge stretching before them like a promise. Javier thought of his mother, her love a seed that had grown into Theo, into wings, into a life he'd fought for. He'd lost his legs, his family, his safety, but he'd built something better, a home, a purpose, a love that didn't flinch. Wings became more than a workshop. It was a beacon for those who'd been told they were less, a place where broken pieces became art. Javier and Theo mentored kids like Riley, teaching them to run, to ride, to dream. They spoke at conferences, their story inspiring others to fight for their own freedom. Javier's blades, etched with wings, carried him through marathons, each step a defiance of his past. Years later, at a community event, Javier looked out at the crowd, kids with prosthetics, families who'd found hope, Theo by his side. He thought of his father, locked away, and felt no anger, only pity. Miguel had tried to break him, but Javier had built something stronger. He'd lost his legs, but he'd found his wings. And with Theo, he'd learned to fly. As the sun set over San Francisco, Javier took Theo's hand, their fingers fitting perfectly. The city glowed, rainbow flags waving in the breeze. And Javier knew he was home, not just in the city, but in himself, in the love they'd built, in the life they'd fought for. He wasn't running anymore. He was soaring.